Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Development Insights podcast, where we bring you ideas, experiences, and insights about real estate development industry. My name is Payam Nursalahi, and I'm super excited to be here with you today. My guest for this episode is Joey Giaimo. So Joey is an architect who specializes in heritage buildings who have existing elements and have heritage values to their communities and the society around them. I've known Joey for a number of years. We worked on a heritage conversion project together a few years back. It was a lot of fun, a lot of quote unquote fun. I'll say that again. And in this episode, we're going to dive deep into what heritage is, how Joey looks at it as an opportunity for and developer to keep certain elements, make their project unique. And we talk about how he is not just the one who talks; he walks the talk. How he used these concepts on his own house. He basically kept the entire old house and turned it into something modern and new. Go through that process in detail. Joey is the founder and the principal at Giaimo Architects. You can look him up online, and he has many years of experience. He's very well known. He's received multiple awards for his work on his projects. And when it comes to heritage, at least in Toronto and the GTA, he's one of the voices that people should listen to. He also is an instructor at Metropolitan University. And I really hope you enjoy this very niche conversation. It's not your daily topic that might come up on the radar on development elsewhere. But having worked, interestingly enough, I've worked on probably 3 or 4 different heritage conversion projects and although they're hard, they're not. They're a lot of fun. And frankly, when done right, the end product becomes extremely unique and valuable, something that you cannot replicate elsewhere. And I believe as we get to more infill projects, the land becomes more scarce. These heritage sites become more and more valuable. So that's why we're dedicating a full episode to this whole discussion of heritage conversion. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you'd like to learn more about Joey or Giaimo Architects, please go to our website at realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. That's all in one phrase. And please don't forget to subscribe. Thank you and enjoy listening to the show. Hey, Joey. Welcome to the show. And thank you very much for being here.
Hi, Payam. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here with you.
I know you as Joey, the heritage expert, and I know there are many, and like I was just mentioning to you, is that during the course of my research for this interview, I figured out there are way more aspects to my friend Joey that I don't know. So that's the good thing. Why don't we start with you and your story and Joey Giaimo? They're always saying that Giaimo.
Yes.
Like get the
yes,
pronunciation right. Okay.
There are many versions, and that is one that I accept. So.
Okay, perfect. Where do we start? Like you are in architectural. You're studying architecture, and why heritage? Let's start from there.
Well, we can start there, but I think to understand how I got into heritage, it's a much sort of longer story.
Okay.
I think it's interesting that when I speak to other people that are also focused on the heritage field or are in the heritage conservation industry, they tell me that they fell into it. And I have a similar story. I wasn't trained in it. I did fall into it with a background in architecture, but I also think I find that a bit unfortunate that a lot of the industry, a lot of the profession at this moment into this and weren't sort of trained or prepared for it when they came into it. And that makes it much more difficult, and it makes practicing it much more difficult because you're learning after your education. So I'll go back a little bit. You mentioned that I have sort of aspects
yeah.
to my career, and part of that is that there is some diversity to it. I did graduate with an undergraduate in architecture from formerly Ryerson, now Toronto Metropolitan University, or TMU. When I graduated, we were in a very deep recession in the city, and I was not able to find work as a young architect. And I started working in the engineering profession. So I worked with a very good engineer, focusing on building code and upgrades to existing buildings with a focus on life safety. At some point, many years later, I did shift into architecture, mostly because the economy was rebounding a little bit and architects were starting to get busy. So I worked for a couple of years with a number of firms, always with a focus on, projects always had a focus on the existing building or on heritage buildings. And then at one point I decided to go back to school and continue my education outside of the city. And I ended up on the West Coast, and I spent about 4 years in Vancouver, and I went to UBC, graduated from there. When I returned, I was expecting to work with design-focused firms because that was where my focus was during my graduate studies. It was not on heritage. It was always on the built condition. It was always about qualities of the city, but it was always with a real design emphasis. But once I got back and before I started developing my portfolio, which I knew would take quite a bit of time, I had a very nice meeting and interview with people at ERA Architects, and they offered me a job, and I stayed there for 7 years. And that is really where I gained my experience in the heritage field. ERA, when I was with them, we were taking on amazing projects, all with an emphasis on heritage conservation, and we were also working with very good design architects in the city in collaboration. I left there to start my own practice because I felt that I wanted to pursue a career that is able to integrate both design and heritage conservation, and I wanted to kind of see how I was able to do that. In the city, the heritage profession and the architectural profession is very much distinct. The heritage professional is really a sort of sub-consultant to the primary design architect. And I think that relationship very well, but I also think there is an opportunity for there to be better sort of collaboration. And also the heritage professional tends to rely heavily more on kind of the technical aspects and the kind of policy aspects when it comes to a project. So I wanted to see if I could combine both the design and heritage. So breaking out on my own, initially as a sole practitioner and then growing as a small office, you tend to take on smaller scale projects, and not unlike many young firms, the majority of my projects were house projects, single family. All the projects now, in retrospect, all the projects renovated or added to existing buildings. There were options for the demolition of the existing homes for new homes, but in researching, in evaluating the existing homes, spoke to our clients and found that there was qualities to them, were characteristics that we thought could benefit them with either an addition or a renovation. Also, our clients decided that they wanted to stay where they were. They did not want to move to another neighborhood. So their context was important to them. And also their existing home as it operated was also important to them. They just needed something a little bit different, a little bit bigger, something that could suit either a couple or a growing family. And it was important to ensure that those qualities would remain within the home and as part of the project. We found that after a few projects that this integration of design and this integration of not necessarily heritage conservation in a formal way, but the idea of retaining an existing building, finding quality in an existing building, and readapting the existing building to suit a changing program or to suit changing clients was something that was important to us and that we were getting pretty good at.
Let's start with the last thing that you said, and that is, I think, it's a good segue. And you're working on projects you were working on the projects that are existing houses. Someone has lived in them, but they're not necessarily heritage, right? Where do you draw the line? Like projects that you deal with existing buildings, someone has lived in the building, there's a lot of family memories, there's the existing use, but there's also the overall heritage. I kind of am hesitant to call it the designation because that has a whole bunch of other things with it.
Yeah.
You can be not designated but still be considered heritage as we know.
Yeah.
And so where do you draw the line? And then I'm gonna have a couple follow-up questions as what do
Okay.
you next.
Okay. Well, so in practice, I mean, for us the line is always blurred because we find value in everything that's existing, whether it's defined as heritage or whether it's not defined as heritage. But for us, I mean, it's sort of simple when it comes to working on a project. And if we're brought on as a heritage consultant, there's an understanding that the building that we are working on is protected in some way by policy, and that there's heritage value that has been placed on this building, and that heritage value been defined by specific heritage attributes. So in that way, there are some rules that need to be followed, or there's sort of respect that needs to be paid to specific elements or components of a building or the building in its entirety. I mean, of course, we pay that respect to existing buildings that are not considered heritage by policy, but also the ones that have less rules, we are able to take more design liberties with and have a little bit more fun with. I mean, I think we have fun. We try to have fun with all our projects, but when there are less rules, there's more opportunity to play.
And going back to me doing research on my friends for this podcast, I came across an article in Globe and Mail on you and essentially your house, which is pretty much, I think, you're walking the talk, if you may, right?
Yes,
And
right.
and that's what you have. So maybe walk us through that concept. So it's a bungalow. I think it's from 1920s or
Yes,
30s,
yes, it
and
is.
then you basically took it on as a project, and now I guess it's something else which is blue. That much I know.
So okay, start with the fact that it's blue. I mean, it is. I'd like to say it's affectionately called the Blue House in the neighborhood.
Very good.
When I was walking home with my son from school, we were down the street, and he looked at the house from a few blocks away, and he asked me why it was blue, and I said to him, "Look at every other house down this block, in front of you and behind you. What color are they?" And he said, "Beige, brown." I said, "Well, don't you think that this street needs a little bit more color?" I mean, there are other reasons why it's blue, but part of it was, I think at that time when we were designing it, and I say we because I designed it with also Mitchell May here in our office, and also I designed it with my wife. She was very much a part of the process. I'm not the type of architect that likes to take credit for designs. We all architects understand that design is very much a collaborative endeavor and involves a lot of people, not just architects, but
Very true.
good consultants like engineers, and the most successful projects work with very good contractors like yourself. And when I speak about my project, I don't like to say I like to refer to the process always as we did this, and it is very much a collaboration. With the Blue House, also formally titled South House, and the reason for that is contextual. In the neighborhood and across the street from us are two low-rise residential buildings, and they are of each other. And to distinguish them, the owners titled one the East Apartments, of course, because it's on the east side, and then the West Apartments, which is on the west side. And our house is directly south of the two, so we
Convenient naming.
we named our house South House. When we moved to the area, you're right, it's a 1920s bungalow. I did quite a bit of research on the area and realized that although it's located in Mississauga, it's actually in the southeast portion of Mississauga, which has a very long history, much longer than Mississauga itself, which was incorporated in the 70s. Southeast Mississauga was once the Toronto Township. And when I was doing research on the neighborhood and on the residential part of the neighborhood, I realized that the homes in the area were part of a 1920s development that was also part of a Ponzi scheme. So the developer had bought a whole bunch of lots, had distributed the lots, and built a number of model homes, which I think my home was one of those homes, and then started selling lots to people and taking their money and then never building the homes. So we think that our home is a remnant of that Ponzi scheme, and amazingly, it stayed intact with no additions over the 100 years. And when we first walked into it, it was a home with 6 rooms, and the total square footage was 500 square feet. When you think about that for a bungalow in the suburbs, is strange because those types of numbers are more related to apartments now in the city
Right.
and never to kind of a suburban bungalow. So we thought that intactness was amazing, and we wanted to kind of maintain that. And of course, the 6 rooms within 550 square feet just was not working for us, and we had just had our first son. So we entirely renovated the interior, and except for replacing the windows, we didn't touch the exterior at all. And we were able to find ways through moving walls and through opening up spaces to have this sort of flexible space that was able to work for our small but growing family. Before my second son was born, we had planned an addition, and that's the addition is the blue part. And again, we kind of the house itself. This time, rather than focusing on the interior of the bungalow, we focused on the exterior of the bungalow. So the addition wraps around a corner of that bungalow and becomes part of the interior. That article that you refer to by Alex Bezikovic is
Yeah.
interesting because
Great writer.
great writer, great critic, and also a very important voice in the city right now, especially with all the sort of challenges that the city is kind of undergoing right now, specifically with
Right.
development. He looked when he visited. He obviously was looking at it in a different way than I had even looked at initially, but he started understanding the exterior of the house was now encased as an interior part of the house as something archaeological. And we had removed the siding to kind of express the old sheathing, the old pine sheathing, which of course had weathered and of course had markings from former termites. And that sort of idea of it being archaeological and sort of sitting reframed within this sort of new space within the house was something that I thought wasn't something that I had thought about, but I thought was very important in documenting because it does become a document, and by doing that we're ensuring that document is preserved and kind of can carry on into the future.
The perspective of basically that's literally what you were just explaining just before that you took something that was existing, it's not necessarily designated as anything heritage, and maybe if someone other than yourself was looking at it, would just be, you know what, we'll just take it down and we're gonna do something new here.
Yeah.
But you guys managed to bring something unique and valuable. I wanted to switch gears a little bit.
Sure.
I want to go to I know you not too long ago you were part of a panel. I think it was called Housing and Heritage, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
I didn't have the opportunity to attend the panel, but the title is intriguing for me and the audience here. And I'll give you a little bit of context that obviously my focus, or what we've been trying to promote for the past few years, has been on the infill mid-rise projects that are within existing communities. And when you talk about existing communities, and the reason I asked you about your house, because I think that's a very good example on a smaller scale of what an infill project could look like, right? And when you go to the existing communities, there's a fabric, there's a culture, and like you said, there's a documented history. It might not be on paper; it's probably on the buildings themselves, right?
Yeah.
And so, if you're a developer, or if you were to put yourself in the shoes of a developer who's going to look at neighborhoods and look at properties that have potentially heritage elements, how would you think about that? And while you're thinking, I'm going to give you a little more context, because you and I both have, I'm sure we've worked with people that the minute you say heritage, either being designated or even close to it, they're just going to run away.
Yeah.
Some of us also know people that have worked with people that, you know what, that's a good challenge. We'll use it and let's go ahead. So how should a developer, I guess that's the question, how should a developer think about an opportunity of a small development, mid-rise infill project in an established neighborhood, Toronto or elsewhere? How should you actually think about this?
I feel that more and more we are becoming more risk averse, and I see it in many ways. I see it in the careers. I see it in the way people parent. I think it's in many sort of aspects of society now, and I think it's probably become more heightened post pandemic. But in development, I see it. I absolutely see it, especially with the larger, very large developments that obviously are very much kind of focused on numbers and are trying to be as risk averse as possible to kind of meet expectations and meet certain goals as it relates to the building itself and also those numbers. I think there's opportunity when you have a slightly smaller project like a mid-rise or a low-rise project to be a little less risk averse or to take more risks. And I find that in these types of projects that also give more opportunity to the challenges that may arise on the site. And let's talk about the heritage building. You're absolutely right. When we start speaking to clients, whether they're developers or whether they already have existing buildings and they want to do something a little bit more with them, always a real sort of concern that the heritage building poses a risk to the project and will make things a lot more complicated. A part of that is they feel that there's going to be a real difficulty moving through the approvals process and working with City Hall. This is a bit odd to me. I mean, we work with City Hall people at City Hall all the time. We work with, in this city, the people at Heritage Planning all the time, and we find that the processes with them are, depending on the project, relatively smooth. And I think part of the reason for that is that we communicate with them and obviously with our clients often, and we ensure that as a project develops, that we continue to communicate and to present the kind of changes over the design of a project. So in terms of approvals, I don't think that there's a big risk there. Of course, the opportunities that an existing or heritage building can give you also kind of presents a lot of challenges, and most of the time it's the challenges of the unforeseen. I mean, I think you and I experienced that in the project that we worked on together, and I think that comes with any project when you have decided to kind of take on working with an existing building or a heritage building. So I think the challenges in some ways are more technical. I also think that the difficulties in working with a heritage building or with an existing building is sometimes more challenging for the architect than it is for the developer. And I say that because I say that because we as architects, and this comes from my experience, and it also comes from my experience as an instructor now at TMU, the young architects are not trained to work with existing buildings. They're trained to work with a site that's a tabula rasa or a clean slate, and this is how ideas are developed, and these are how concepts are developed. And of course, when you're trained that way and you shift into practice, this is the way you think about design, and this is where your comfort level is. To take on a project that has an existing building it can be very complicated for even an architect, and many times they will, if there's an opportunity, tend to try to move forward with a design that has less on the site in order to kind of allow them to be more creative. I think part of the issue is that the profession relies heavily on their authorship, on their identity as an architect, and that identity comes through many times in new work and many times in the sort of kind of style that they have developed for themselves. That's very hard to do when you're working with an existing building, when you have to sort of assume or share authorship with an architect who is no longer around, had built or designed a building based on ideas from 100 or more or less years ago. It's a very difficult thing for the contemporary architect to kind of to understand and to kind of take on as part of their work.
Like you said, I think that was like to share the authorship of that building, right? Like it's that's very true. But I think you would also agree that like in that particular case, the Sunday school lofts that you and I worked together on, obviously we're biased, or at least I'm biased. But at the end of the day, I think having to preserve the whole facade and the old windows and the stained glass as an example also gave that. Don't get me wrong, it was really hard for us to do, for all of us, everyone involved in the project. But it also gave the building and the project and even the new portion something to brag about, if you may.
Hmm.
It's something to leverage and stand out. And I want to kind of go on a limb out on a limb and say it would have been probably difficult to get the same effect if we were building everything new in that
Yeah.
particular project. I'm
Yeah.
wondering what your thoughts are.
I mean, yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think like this is the value of heritage, that when there is the heritage building is retained on site, and when it's integrated with a development, then that project becomes distinct from any other project in the city. I mean, the development is so rapid here, and so many buildings of different scales are going up, and there's a real sort of familiarity in all of them. Maybe not so much in the details or materials and in the form, but there's a real sort of kind of consistency in the way that we're designing now. So I feel like in some ways, architects who design new buildings are somewhat more restricted in some ways. When there's a heritage building on the site, you have to kind of take it on, and that means you have to think a little bit differently, and you have to approach the residential unit a little bit differently, or you have to approach the office building a little bit differently. And by doing that, it forces you to kind of on a design attitude that is different from a building coming from a clean slate. And I think what ends up happening is that there's a richer project that comes out of it. I think the project that we worked on together is an excellent example of that. And also, I mean, we also are still very close with our client, and I'm not the kind of architect that wraps up a project and walks away from it.
Right.
I constantly go back to it. And I go back to it because I want to understand, was this successful? Is it successful for the client? Is it something that the client, after going through the process and after having some distance from it, is it something that they would take on again? And I think I do have these discussions with our client. And although it was challenging, it was a very successful project for them. And it not only obviously expanded their portfolio, but it also made their portfolio richer.
Right.
They also have taken on other challenging projects. And when you kind of look at the built work, there's a real, like, that's how you distinguish yourself as a developer or as a landlord of a building. You distinguish yourself by having a number of sort of distinct projects across the board. And the heritage building or the existing building brings you that distinction. So
Very
even with
true.
our work, when you're flipping through our website, I don't think you can't pinpoint a style. That we don't have a particular style, because we're always riffing off of the style that's given to us, whether it's like a ranch bungalow, or whether it's a raised bungalow from the 1920s, or whether it's an Art Deco building from the 1920s, or an old industrial building. We're in there, we're working in there, but it's a quieter way of working. It's making a building better. It's respecting the original author, and it's kind of giving something that ensures that the building can kind of carry on for hopefully another 100 years.
I really like this whole term author. I'd never thought about it that way, but yeah, you're right. And the reason when you go through your website, you don't see any basically copies or cookie cutters there is that because you're a flexible co-author, if you may, and
Mm.
you're just moving from an anchor point to the other one. And I wanted to use this as an off ramp to one of the reasons we do this podcast is to try and help form a decision making process in terms of steps and how to think about things, how to make decisions, and how to learn from previous projects. I guess the way I'm thinking of going through this with you is this: what, like, obviously we talked about the Sunday school lofts there, but are there any other projects that you would consider to be successful heritage conversion or heritage restoration or a variety of that? And by successful, I don't just mean we did a good job of cleaning them up, but also
Mhm.
maybe, or actually, you know what? Let me ask you, what is your definition of a successful heritage conversion or conservation project?
Well, I mean, I will be able to give an example. But my idea of a successful conversion project is one that can take on an entire building, mostly intact or all intact, and able to, in a clever way, rework it, redesign it, whether that's on the exterior or on the interior, and readapt it to contemporary use. And just as important as bringing it to a contemporary use is understanding how it can be used in the future. And obviously we can't kind of see into the future, but if you're able to kind of provide through your design a flexible space or spaces that is constantly adaptable, and there are very specific ways of doing that, not only through architecture, but also through mechanical systems, electrical systems, building
Very
envelope.
important.
Very important. There are ways of doing that and to kind of create an interior space that can kind of be readapted moving forward. I think part of our responsibility when we look at these existing buildings is that we see their value and we understand that their value has an age value to it, right? And we want to kind of on that age value. So it's our responsibility to do that, and part of doing that is to ensure that it's not just useful now, but that it's useful in decades to come. And that's important to us because when we take on a project, many times we're undoing so much,
Right.
undoing so much that was not sort of thought about, that was not coherent, and we're stripping it all back in order to kind of rethink it so that it is more coherent and it is more sort of flexible and adaptable in the future. One of our recent projects, which we're very close to completing, is the Hermit Building at 19 and 21 Dundas Square. It's on the southeast corner of Dundas Square, and it's a sort of two-part building built in 1913 and 1929, and on the outside it reads as two distinct buildings because they are, but on the inside they're integrated. And over the years, there was a lot of sort of renovations and additions on the inside that really sort of muddled up what was spectacular about that interior space, which was the abundance of light and the kind of incredible volume of the interior that was blocked up by all the partitions and kind of the almost excessive tenancies that were in there. So with our client, we had determined that we needed to kind of open up those spaces, remove all the sort of partitions and remove all the kind of extraneous work that was done over time, and to kind of bring back that volume, bring back that natural light. It's a corner building, so it faces east and north and west. So there's just so much opportunity to create this naturally lit space, which we were able to do. What that also meant is that we also had to think practically, and where do you put enclosed rooms, and where do you put base building services? And we determined that on the south side of the building had no windows, a result of a high-rise development. We were able to put all the core services along the south end. We were able to put enclosed rooms along the south end, and leaving the north part and the east-west sort of run of the building open to open office space and for more sort of flexible layout now and in the future.
So what I'm hearing right now is that your definition includes being able to age well, even further.
Yeah.
Right. Being able to create new practical use, I guess, right? Something that might have not been envisioned in the beginning. And one thing you mentioned there, and yeah, I can totally agree with that, is, and we've had this discussion many times with other professionals, is that like how we always trying to improve the quality of the buildings when it comes to the systems, the material, the installations, the wiring, the plumbing. Like I believe that we are building better buildings these days than we were like 50 years ago. The process hasn't improved that much. It still takes long and expensive, but better buildings. And I guess one of the challenges with these older buildings or existing or heritage buildings is bringing them up to par with the quality of what the current residents will expect, right? And also, but also you almost have to, what you were saying is you also foresee that, you know what, because we've already done this, in 50 years from now, 70 years from now, you also want to have a little bit of more breathing room if something else happens, if you need
Hmm.
to upgrade something and make some other changes.
Hmm.
I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud here. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think in the past, architecture and the construction industry have really been kind of focused on the project itself, and the project itself has a start date and has an end date. I think, our profession is changing, and that sort of simplistic way of thinking about architecture and the approach to a building is kind of broadened significantly. It's not about the building itself anymore. It's about sort of the larger context around it. It's not about designing within a bubble anymore. It's about bringing the community in to kind of give their thoughts about this building that will obviously impact them. Sunday School Lofts was a result of the community coming together and telling the city and telling our client that church was important to them and had value to them, and that church in some way, understanding that new residential was going in there, that church in some way had to be commemorated. Architecture now has sort of broadened its sort of parameters and in some ways broadened its reach. And part of that is not just thinking about building at the time, but thinking about the building in the future. And maybe this is a good segue to think about ideas and understand that we are in a climate crisis or a climate emergency,
Yeah.
and that the construction industry weighs in heavily on that. And we need to, as architects and as constructors and as developers, we need to kind of start to think differently about how we build, and that the reuse of a building or the reuse of material is the best way to sort of ensure that we waste less, that we reduce our embodied carbon. There's a movement now, circular economy movement, that is this sort of incredible concept that rather than thinking in a linear way about construction, we think of it in a circular way. Buildings may go away and buildings may stay, but the opportunity to kind of reuse materials from buildings or portions of buildings that go away is important to kind of ensure that the lifespan, not just of a building, but also of the fabric that makes up this building, can carry on in other ways. So I think these are ideas that are starting to be integrated into our practice specifically, but also that's part of a larger idea of sustainability. And I think these ideas of sustainability, however you frame sustainability, has become very important to the architecture profession. And it's something that we see is starting to become more important to our clients and also to constructors. I mean, there's still a long way to go, but it is something that we need to really think about.
It seems to me as well that it has moved from a very kind of pie in the sky, dreamy thing to have on but it has moved to something that's it's part of the daily discussion right now, which is a
Yeah.
great improvement. It's probably not there yet in the scale that we need it to be, but definitely moving in the right direction. And I want to go back to one thing that you mentioned there, because I think going back to the original question, when you're a developer, you're looking at a piece of land or property or existing building that has heritage elements. Probably one of the first thoughts is that, okay, how's the community going to deal with this idea and this proposal? And you also mentioned the successful interaction that we had on the Sunday School Lofts project, right? And maybe can we a little bit expand on that, maybe, because I think I'm going to throw this out there that probably part of it has to do with the shift in the mindset of the
Mm.
community as well, saying, you know what, we have all these old buildings and they're just going downward, it's deteriorating, it's getting worse, and what can we do about it? Versus the balance of the I hate to say it, but it's a common misconception that the evil developers are going to come in and it's going
Hmm.
to take over the neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
How do we draw that line? How do we have that dialogue, if you may, and how do we go through the process?
Well, I mean, I think if we want to use Sunday School Lofts as an example, I mean, our client has a portfolio of very good projects, both new buildings and also existing buildings that are adaptively reused. This one was a bit of a peculiar one because when the project started, the building that was there was not considered to have heritage value and it wasn't protected at all. And for me, if there's one type of architectural typology that is so difficult to readapt, it is the church building. And the irony there is that there are so many church buildings that are being freed up from being churches, and it's a real challenge now for for readapting them. And then Sunday school lofts was also very much one of those challenges. So when our client was originally looking at the site and understanding it had no heritage value, they decided that they were going to, and also the real complexities in kind of readapting a church, they were looking at designing a building that would be suitable for the site, that would be suitable for the context, but that did not include the church building in it. So I think when it was understood that that was going to be the approach and the community recognized that they sort of came forward and expressed their concern, and they thought that the church did have value for them. And I think that was important because our client listened, as I think all good clients do and all good developers do, and they understood that if the building did have value in this community, that they would ensure that the building would sort of would carry on and would be integrated as part of the project.
So, listening is important. Yeah. At the very least, the listening part is very important.
So listening is important. The more these processes are always very difficult, but the more that you communicate, you present ideas, you bring in sort of the stakeholders, whether it's people at City Hall or whether it's the community or other consultants, then the more you bring those people in throughout the process, I think the smoother the process goes, the project can be.
Perfect. And so just going to go back to something that you mentioned at the beginning of our chat, that many architects, or actually almost all of the architects, are not trained to deal with heritage. They're not trained to deal with the existing elements, if you may. And I know obviously you do training, you train a whole bunch of new architects. What would you do different, or what are you doing differently to make sure these guys or these ladies are equipped? Because as I mentioned, I think we're going to see a lot more of these things, or we'll have to see a lot of more of these mixed projects with heritage and existing elements.
Well, I think what I'm doing at Toronto Metropolitan University is I am ensuring that at some point in the students' academic careers that they are exposed and gain experience to working with a heritage building or with working with an existing building. So I said earlier, it's a lot of their design studios emphasize concept, and that concept tends to be developed on a tabula rasa or a clean slate. And my design studios take the opposite approach. It's actually looking at the site as a tabula plena, that there's a lot of stuff there that is important, whether it's on the immediate site or whether it's around it, that design has to really tap into and take on and understand. So I teach primarily two courses there. One is a heritage conservation course, theory and practice, and another one is, right now I'm teaching a master's level 1 studio. And whenever I teach a design studio, I have the opportunity to design the studio. In this case, I'm co-teaching with a colleague of mine, Professor Joey Giaimo, who is also interested in these ideas. And we start the studio by asking the students to select a place that has a personal connection to them and that they want to ultimately be responsible for its transformation in some way. By connecting the student with a place where they have memories either as a child or where they have current experiences, immediately they understand the value of the existing, whether it is heritage, quote unquote, or whether it's just this sort of place with history. And by connecting them to that, then they understand that it's valuable, and then we ask them to be more objective about it and to do exhaustive research to understand this place better and to understand it from a different perspective. So after weeks of doing that, we then ask them to intervene on it in a way that they think is appropriate and to also adaptively reuse this place or this building for something that they feel is relevant now and could be
Hmm.
reused now. So it's really, I think my sort of injection into academia at the Department of Architectural Science at TMU is exposure to understanding how to work with existing buildings and to give them a more diverse sort of design experience so that when they do go out and practice and they do start working on different projects, that there's a comfort level in working both with the existing and also with the new.
That sounds like a that
Well,
sounds
look,
like a fun class to be part of.
well, I think so. I mean, I mean, the students tell me that many students come after the experience, whether it's in the heritage course or in the studio, that it was very important for them. It was challenging because they had to almost retrain the way they think about design for them to adapt to the studio process. But I think it's important, and also don't think there's enough of it. TMU has kind of understood that this exposure is important to students, but across Canada, except for some the lectures or seminars or design studios taking on the existing building or the heritage building is almost non-existent. And I
Right.
think again, like for many reasons, also that again going back to the fact that we're in a climate crisis and that we have to kind of understand how to readapt existing buildings, I think it's so important that students get that exposure. And
And
it needs
it's
to be
very
more across
important
the
to
board.
get the conversation going and like have it have I guess the new generation of designers and architects and engineers have it primed, have priming their mind. I'm pretty sure this is going to become more and more unavoidable, if you may,
Yeah.
when you think about the concept of developing in existing cities, and when we basically start running out of land and you cannot just sprawl out of the city and go build new suburbs 100 kilometers in each direction, which is definitely also not good for the environment to do that. I want to start wrapping this up by asking you a few short questions, and then I'm going to ask you at the end if
Oh
there's
boy.
anything you want to add. I guess from your perspective, if someone wanted to learn more about heritage, and not just for the sake of learning about heritage, for sake of what we just talked about, the opportunities, the challenges, and actually how to make a good project work. Are there any references, websites, or bodies that you would kind of suggest people to follow, go educate themselves, and learn about?
Uh, I mean, yes, there is a lot of content out there. I mean, immediately springing up is the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario
Mm-hmm.
has, as part of their website, they have a platform called TO Built, and TO Built is populated with I'm definitely saying hundreds. I don't know if I can say thousands, but of existing and heritage buildings that are important and that don't necessarily get documented in many places. So it's all sort of available on this website, and also in some of the posts there are links to research. It's sort of I compare it to the Wikipedia of architecture. The
Right.
posts are sort of created by a number of people, by architects, by people of the community. Also, a few of my architecture students have also contributed to this as well, and I think it's an important resource.
Very good. So TO built. Okay. And I've heard you talk about, I think you called it facadism, if I'm not wrong. That was the
Oh,
first word.
okay, yeah,
That's the first time I heard that word.
yeah, yeah.
So maybe walk us through that a little bit. And
Facadism is a term given to an approach in architecture that, in mostly in larger development or in development projects, that preserves what is determined to have the most heritage value of a building, which is primarily the principal facade. And projects will retain that facade and then remove the rest of the building in order for new development. This idea of facadism is actually become, well, let's talk about trends. I mean, in the current climate and with the kind of intense development that's happening in the city, many properties with heritage buildings are prime for redevelopment and for the integration of typically tall office or multi-unit residential towers. It has become a trend, where the facade of the heritage building is maintained and restored and kind of repositioned back into the public realm, and then what happens behind it is brand new. There are different sort of ideas about the value of facadism. Many people think that it's just a cosmetic form of conservation, that it's a commemoration of a building, but it's not a building itself. And I think in some ways, facadism for some projects is appropriate and can enhance the new project. And I think that Sunday School Lofts is an excellent example of that. But when it becomes a trend for all development, then it doesn't allow opportunities for other ideas about the integration of the heritage building with new architecture. And what happens is that in that way, the heritage building is not able to play a role in that project, and is not able to kind of really
I guess it becomes minimized. Like
it becomes minimized. It becomes more about the way it kind of responds to the public realm, but less about how it responds to the architecture itself, because the architecture itself, the interior of it is long gone. So it's for me it's, I mean, this is not, facadism is not defined as heritage conservation. For me, it's commemoration, really. It's the commemoration of a building that was once there, and it's understood that it formed part of a block, or it formed part of this site, but it's now gone, and this is a way to memorialize it.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. This was very informative for myself at the very least, and I've learned quite a bit. Is there anything that I should have asked you that I didn't, or is there any other final thoughts or points that you want our audience to know before we wrap this up?
I mean, I think we've covered quite a bit. I hope that what we spoke about today resonates. I hope it resonates with people out there who are building our city. I think the developers out there that are building up the city, I hope they also recognize that they have a responsibility to the city and to the larger community, and that part of the responsibility is sort of ensuring that the history of the city can sort of carry on in some way, sometimes through commemorative ways, but I'm hoping also mostly through more sort of impactful and ways that really speak to the stories of the city and really speak to the city's histories.
Thank you very much, Joey, and really appreciate your time. Really appreciate you taking the time to do this. If people want to find you, they can reach out to you, I guess, on your website, the Giaimo Architects, or if other means you want to share with them.
Yeah, they could reach me through our website. They could also get a hold of me through Instagram, LinkedIn.
You're active. You're active. Yeah. Too many means these days.
Yes, I know. There's too many means. So we're on all those channels. So we're easy to get a hold of. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just one last thing before you leave. We have developed a comprehensive guide of resources that people in the industry are using to make better decisions or keep themselves on top of the trends, learn about new products, technologies. These include books, websites, blog, podcasts, YouTube channels, apps, and softwares. And people are using them to make better design decisions, investment decisions, or engineering decisions. And I'm sure that you're going to find this very helpful, but hopefully it will save you dozens of hours when you need it, and who knows, maybe even more. This is a live document that we're going to keep updating every few months. Please go to our website, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com, and you can get a free copy of this document for yourself, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com, to get the free PDF resource. Thank you very much.